The Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., was quiet that morning, yet charged with anticipation. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Students, journalists, and citizens filled the gallery, their eyes fixed on the courtroom floor. The air buzzed with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. Today wasn't just another hearing. Today, Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman known for her calm yet incisive questioning, was set to speak on a case that touched on free speech, online responsibility, and individual rights. And the Chief Justice, John Roberts, was known for his precise control of proceedings. Everyone sensed that sparks could fly not in anger, but in tension between authority and perspective. Roberts entered first, his steps measured, his expression calm. The courtroom fell silent as he took his place at the bench. He began with his usual formality, reminding the participants of the rules, the limits of discussion, and the structure of legal debate. His voice was even clear and authoritative. He stressed that the court's focus was on legal precedent, on consistency, on the correct application of law. Any discussion outside those boundaries, he warned, could disrupt proceedings. The audience listened respectfully, aware of the weight behind his words. Roberts's role wasn't just to lead it, was to maintain the integrity of the court, ensuring that debate stayed grounded in law. Crockett approached the podium with a calm, deliberate pace. She didn't rush, she didn't overstate, and she didn't confront aggressively. Instead, her presence carried quiet authority. She scanned the room, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Then she began, her voice clear, firm, but polite. "Chief Justice Roberts," she said, "I understand the importance of legal precedent. But we must also consider the real people affected by these decisions. Legal theory is important, but human experience cannot be ignored." Her words were simple, yet powerful. They drew the room's attention immediately. The tension was subtle, but unmistakable. Here was someone challenging the boundaries of the discussion, not with disrespect, but with insight. Roberts raised an eyebrow, maintaining his composure. He reminded her of the court's procedures and the necessity of keeping discussion within legal reasoning. He emphasized that personal stories, while compelling, couldn't replace the authority of law. Yet Crockett didn't falter. She acknowledged his points but reframed her argument, asking how the law could remain fair if it didn't consider the people it affected. The chamber shifted. Observers could feel the energy change. The debate was no longer only about legal principles, it was about real consequences, lived experiences, and the intersection of law and everyday life. Crockett began giving examples, not hypothetical, dry illustrations, but vivid, relatable scenarios. She spoke of college students navigating social media, fearful of rules they didn't fully understand. She described small business owners trying to comply with complex regulations, while juggling financial and operational pressures. She highlighted families concerned about privacy and freedom of expression, navigating digital spaces where law and life collided. The stories were short but impactful, bringing clarity and immediacy to abstract legal concepts. Every person in the room could relate to some element. The chamber wasn't tense, infer it was alert, reflective. Curious. Roberts maintained his calm authority, presenting the counterpoint that law must remain consistent to be fair. He explained that while individual situations are important, the judiciary's role is to create frameworks that apply broadly, predictably, and impartially. In other words, fairness comes not from exception, but from structure. The logic was clear, and it was the reason he held his position. But the room could feel the difference in framing. Crockett's examples brought faces, emotions, and daily struggles into the abstract world of precedent. Her approach reminded the audience that law is not just words on paper, interacts with lives, communities, and choices in ways that cannot always be anticipated. The exchange began to feel like a careful dance. Roberts spoke with authority, citing past rulings, principles of consistency. and the importance of maintaining judicial boundaries. Crockett responded with empathy and context, framing questions in ways that made the audience consider practical consequences. Each of her points was deliberate, challenging without confrontation, insightful without aggression. She didn't attack the court or Roberts personally. She illuminated gaps that numbers, precedents, and strict logic could never fully capture. The courtroom was quiet, but charged, as if every listener was holding their breath, waiting to see how the balance between law and life would unfold. Her questioning highlighted the tension inherent in modern governance. Rules are necessary to maintain order and fairness, but real life is complex, messy, and unpredictable. Crockett emphasized that even the best-intended laws can create unintended stress or hardship if human factors are overlooked. She asked, "How do we ensure that protections do not become restrictions, that guidance does not become punishment?" These were simple questions, but they carried weight. Students jotted down notes, journalists adjusted microphones, and spectators leaned forward. Intrigued by how calmly and clearly she had reframed the discussion, Roberts listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. He acknowledged the challenge of balancing structure and human experience. While he defended the principles of consistency and stability, he did not dismiss the importance of perspective. The audience sensed a subtle shift. The hearing was no longer just about enforcing procedure. It had become a conversation, a dialogue where authority and human insight met, where law and lived experience were both considered. The room seemed to pause, collectively absorbing the complexity of what was unfolding. Crockett continued, illustrating micro-level consequences of rigid application of rules. She described how a single oversight could have ripple effects for families, students, and business owners. Each example reinforced her point that law, no matter how carefully crafted, interacts with life in unpredictable ways. By grounding the discussion in tangible experiences, she made abstract legal concepts accessible. The audience, from students to seasoned professionals, could imagine themselves or someone they knew in those scenarios. The chamber's energy grew reflective, almost reverent, as people realized they were witnessing a conversation about law that had real emotional stakes. Roberts responded with procedural clarity, outlining safeguards, review processes, and checks designed to prevent unfair outcomes. Yet Crockett's method had already reframed the discussion. It wasn't a matter of defying authority. It was about expanding understanding. Her calm persistence showed that authority and empathy were not mutually exclusive, they could coexist. The courtroom observed a rare moment where human perspective was elevated alongside legal reasoning, creating space for critical thinking, reflection, and dialogue. By the end of the first part of the hearing, no verdict had been reached, and no single viewpoint had won. Yet everyone in the room had witnessed a shift in thinking. Roberts had defended the importance of consistency, structure, and legal rigor. Crockett had introduced clarity, empathy, and human relevance. The audience left with questions, not answers, and a sense that law is not merely abstracted, is lived, felt, and experienced in ways that structure alone cannot predict. As the session concluded, the sunlight outside continued to cast long shadows, but inside, a subtle illumination had taken hold. The debate between Roberts and Crockett had started as a clash of formality and principle. Yet it became an exploration of balance between authority and perspective, law and life, rules and human experience. Students, journalists, and citizens lingered, discussing what they had witnessed, reflecting on fairness, responsibility, and the role of empathy in governance. The stage was set for deeper questioning, continued reflection, and a debate that promised to resonate far beyond the walls of the Supreme Court. The courtroom was alive with quiet energy the next morning, the kind that makes you lean forward without realizing it. After the initial exchange, everyone knew the hearing would not be ordinary. JohnRoberts.com and composed prepared to continue defending the principles of law and structure. His focus was clear. Consistency, predictability, and adherence to precedent were essential for justice to function. Yet, the audience could already sense that Crockett's perspective had shifted the tone. She had planted the idea that law alone, no matter how carefully designed, could not fully account for human experience. Roberts opened the session by outlining safeguards. He explained that the judicial system had layers of review, procedural checks, and standards to ensure that no individual would suffer unfairly. In theory, these mechanisms worked perfectly. In practice, Crockett had already shown the room that real-life consequences rarely fit neatly into procedural boxes. She listened intently as Roberts spoke, nodding occasionally. Her calm presence a reminder that law intersects with life in ways numbers and procedures cannot always capture. When she spoke again, it was with measured precision. Crockett reminded the audience that laws are not abstractions. They affect families, students, and small businesses every day. She asked how the court could ensure fairness when ordinary people make mistakes or struggle to understand complex rules. One by one, she outlined scenarios. A student facing penalties for online posts made in good faith. A small business misinterpreting a regulation while trying to comply. A family adjusting to digital privacy measures that seemed protective in theory but restrictive in practice. Each example was short but vivid, immediately relatable, and the audience leaned in, imagining themselves or people they knew in similar situations. Roberts responded with calm authority, reiterating that consistency must come first, and that exceptions risked eroding the structure necessary for fair rulings. Yet Crockett's framing made it clear that structure without human perspective could feel cold and unresponsive. She wasn't attacking the system. She was pointing out its limitations, asking the court to recognize the balance between procedure and reality. Her questions were simple but precise. How do we prevent rules meant to protect from unintentionally punishing? How do we ensure that fairness reaches everyone, not just those who perfectly navigate the system? The tension in the room grew, but not in hostility. It was the tension of ideas clashing respectfully. Students scribbled notes rapidly, inspired by the clarity of her examples. Journalists adjusted microphones, realizing that the moments most likely to resonate with viewers weren't charts, statistics, or precedent. They were the real-life implications Crockett was highlighting. Citizens in the gallery nodded, whispering to each other about scenarios that mirrored their own experiences. It was a rare moment when law and life met in a visible, tangible way. Crockett's strategy was deliberate. She moved from broad concepts to specific, human-focused examples. She spoke of teenagers navigating digital spaces, trying to express themselves without running afoul of rules that were often vague. She described single parents balancing work and online interactions for school or health services, trying to comply with laws they barely understood. She even painted a picture of elderly citizens navigating digital bureaucracy, facing unexpected complications simply by trying to follow the rules. Each example demonstrated how good intentions in law could have unexpected consequences when lived experience is overlooked. Roberts acknowledged her points politely, emphasizing that safeguards were designed to catch such situations. He explained that the law had flexibility built in, and that courts could consider context in individual cases. Yet, Crockett anticipated each counterpoint, illustrating how even well-meaning procedures could fail in practice. Her calm, steady logic made it impossible to ignore that law, without consideration of lived experience, might inadvertently create burdens. The audience could sense the balance shifting subtly. Neither side had conceded, but the dynamic was evolving into something more reflective than combative. Crockett continued, highlighting ripple effects that reached beyond the individual. One minor penalty could disrupt a student's education, affect a family's stability, or challenge a small business's survival. By connecting legal principles to real consequences, she reframed the debate. The audience began to see the challenge the court faced. Rules are necessary. But human life is complex, full of nuances and unexpected complications. Every example she offered emphasized the intersection of law and humanity. And it resonated deeply. Roberts attempted to steer back to legal theory, reminding the audience that broad rules ensure fairness for all, not just for individual cases. Consistency, he argued, prevents favoritism and bias. Yet Crockett's approach showed that consistency alone does not guarantee justice. Understanding and anticipating human behavior is equally critical. She didn't need to argue loudly. Her examples spoke for themselves, creating an invisible tug-of-war between the abstract and the practical. Students, journalists, and citizens alike found themselves reflecting on their own experiences as the debate unfolded. The energy in the courtroom was almost palpable. Crockett's calm persistence contrasted with Roberts' measured authority. Each question she asked prompted reflection, forcing the audience to think critically about how law interacts with daily life. She didn't interrupt or disrespect. She questioned and illustrated. One moment she would describe a student's predicament. The next, a small business struggling to comply with new privacy rules. These scenarios gave abstract principles tangible form. Even Roberts had to acknowledge, with a subtle shift in his expression, that her perspective illuminated the human side of decisions. The law often abstracts. The audience's engagement grew steadily. People leaned forward in their seats, some whispering to neighbors, others jotting notes or quietly nodding. Students discussed the implications of what they were hearing, imagining themselves or their communities navigating the legal frameworks. Reporters adjusted cameras and microphones, capturing the moments most likely to resonate online. Crockett's calm, structured questioning was teaching the audience a critical lesson. Law is not just about rules. It is about people living under those rules. As the morning session progressed, the balance between authority and perspective became increasingly clear. Roberts defended the structure of the law, highlighting consistency and precedent. Crockett humanized those structures, revealing how the consequences of legal decisions extend far beyond the courtroom. Her examples were brief, her questions clear, and her reasoning undeniable. The audience could see both sides, the necessity of law and the importance of empathy. Both perspectives were valid, yet neither could fully succeed without considering the other. By the end of Part 2, the courtroom had transformed from a formal procedural space into a forum for reflection. No final judgment had been reached, but the discussion had deepened, expanded, and humanized the issues at hand. Roberts maintained his authority, emphasizing structure and consistency, while Crockett highlighted practical consequences, fairness, and human understanding. The audience left the session with questions, reflections, and a newfound appreciation for the complexity of legal decisions in a modern world. Outside the chamber, the city seemed alive with conversation. Students, lawyers, and ordinary citizens discussed what they had seen, replaying her examples in their minds. Social media feeds were already alive with clips, highlighting how human experience could shape the understanding of law. Crockett had managed to elevate the discussion beyond procedure, showing that empathy and insight could coexist with authority and structure. The tension between abstract rules and lived experience remained unresolved. But it was a tension that inspired thought, conversation, and reflection. By the time the courtroom emptied, the echoes of the discussion lingered. Crockett's calm insistence on perspective, Roberts' commitment to consistency, and the audience's engagement had created a moment of clarity. The debate had become more than a hearing. It was an exploration of balance, responsibility, and human consequence. Law was necessary, yes, but human understanding was equally essential. The first half of this hearing had concluded, leaving everyone curious, reflective, and eager for what would unfold next. The courtroom had grown still, but the tension was far from gone. JohnRoberts.com and Methodical reviewed his notes, preparing to reinforce his points on precedent, consistency, and legal authority. The gallery watched quietly, anticipating the next turn. Jasmine Crockett, composed and deliberate, had already shifted the energy. Her calm, human-centered approach had challenged the courtroom to consider consequences beyond law, beyond procedure. Today, she would push further, showing how abstract rules intersect with real lives in unexpected ways. Roberts opened, reiterating that laws must maintain structure to function fairly. Without clear, consistent application, he argued, the justice system risks bias, unpredictability, and chaos. He reminded the chamber that exceptions, while necessary in rare cases, to weaken legal authority if applied inconsistently. His voice was firm but measured, reflecting decades of judicial experience. Yet, even as he spoke, the audience sensed a subtle challenge. Crockett had already framed the debate in human terms, and authority alone could not answer the questions she had raised. Crockett's turn came smoothly. She did not interrupt. She waited, letting Roberts finish, then spoke with clarity. "Chief Justice Roberts," she began, "structure is important, yes, but structure without understanding leaves people behind." She quickly illustrated her point. A student had been disciplined for sharing opinions on social media without realizing the rules were interpreted broadly. A small business owner had struggled to follow digital privacy regulations, inadvertently violating technicalities despite good intentions. A single mother trying to navigate online services had faced confusing requirements, leaving her unsure how to comply. These were real scenarios, simple and relatable, that connected abstract legal discussion to everyday life. Roberts listened, maintaining his calm composure. But Crockett's examples made the room quiet, reflective. She didn't belabor the points. She spoke precisely, giving just enough detail for clarity. Her method worked. Students leaned forward, whispering to one another, imagining themselves in these situations. Journalists adjusted microphones, realizing that the moments most compelling for viewers were not charts or rulings, but the human consequences she was highlighting. Citizens in the gallery nodded subtly, recognizing how law affects daily routines in ways often overlooked. She moved quickly between examples, each one reinforcing her central theme. Legal frameworks cannot exist in isolation from human behavior. One mistake under the law could ripple through a family, disrupt a student's education, or threaten the survival of a small business. Even when procedures include safeguards, Crockett argued, people can face consequences that are technically fair but practically harmful. Her calm, steady reasoning made it impossible to dismiss the importance of perspective alongside authority. The courtroom, a space usually dominated by legal abstraction, was now engaged in humanized reflection. Roberts countered with precision, emphasizing the need for consistency. Without strict adherence to rules, he explained, fairness itself becomes subjective, and judicial discretion risks bias. He outlined mechanisms designed to catch mistakes, highlighting review procedures and appeals that protect individuals while maintaining system integrity. But Crockett anticipated these points. She asked, even with reviews, how do we ensure no one suffers unnecessarily? How do we balance protection with flexibility, authority with humanity? Her phrasing was simple, but the weight of the questions was undeniable. Every person listening could feel the tension between principle and practice. The dynamic intensified. Roberts maintained logical authority. Crockett emphasized human consequence. Neither raised her voice, neither interrupted aggressively. Yet the contrast was electric. Students, reporters, and citizens in the gallery were drawn into the subtle clash. Thinking critically about how law interacts with everyday life, each question Crockett posed invited reflection, not argument. She had created a space where the audience could See both sides: the necessity of structured rules and the importance of anticipating real-life impact. Crockett began connecting micro-level effects to broader societal consequences. She described how restrictions on speech, when applied rigidly, could suppress dialogue, discourage civic engagement, and create fear in communities. She highlighted how digital rules meant to protect privacy could, in practice, lead to confusion, penalties, or unnecessary stress for ordinary citizens. Roberts responded with legal reasoning, emphasizing the importance of uniformity and predictability in maintaining justice. Yet Crockett's human-focused framing showed that fairness cannot exist solely in the abstract, it must reach the lives it affects. Her strategy was methodical. She alternated between concrete examples and open-ended questions, forcing the audience to consider the balance of law and life. One moment, she spoke of a college student penalized for a minor social media post. The next, a local business navigating complex compliance measures. Each example made the abstract tangible, the rules real, the consequences immediate. She didn't need dramatic gestures or loud interruptions. Her calm, precise framing did all the work. The audience, students, and professionals alike found themselves reflecting on scenarios they could relate to personally. The tension was now thoughtful rather than confrontational. Roberts maintained his authority, emphasizing law, consistency, and precedent. Crockett maintained her calm, highlighting human consequences and inviting reflection. The balance of the room shifted subtly with each exchange. The hearing was no longer just a procedural discussion, had become an exploration of responsibility, empathy, and fairness. Observers could see that legal reasoning without perspective risks overlooking the people who live under its rules. Conversely, human-centered perspective without structure risks unpredictability. Both were necessary, but the challenge was in balance. Crockett's calm persistence created a subtle narrative arc: the human consequences of law, when ignored, can cascade in ways abstract rules cannot predict. She illustrated how mistakes, even minor ones, could affect education, work, family stability, and social participation. She posed questions to the audience that invited them to consider how rules intersect with real life. Roberts, experienced and composed, countered with logic, precedent, and safeguards. The interplay highlighted the essence of the debate: balancing authority with empathy, rules with reality. By mid-session, it was clear that the courtroom dynamic had shifted. Crockett had succeeded in expanding the discussion beyond procedural confines. Roberts's points were sound in principle, but her examples reminded everyone that law exists to serve people, not the other way around. Students whispered reflections to one another. Journalists adjusted cameras for live coverage, and citizens nodded thoughtfully, imagining their own interactions with the rules. The hearing had become more than a case study, it was a reflection on law's impact on daily life. As Part 3 drew to a close, the balance between structure and empathy became the central theme. Roberts upheld consistency and authority. Crockett highlighted human consequences. The audience walked away with questions, not answers, and a deeper understanding of how laws affect real people. The chamber had transformed from a procedural space into a forum for reflection, critical thinking, and nuanced understanding. The tension between authority and perspective was now visible, appreciated, and intellectually engaging. Outside the courtroom, the city hummed with discussion. Students debated scenarios Crockett had outlined. Journalists highlighted her examples for social media coverage. Citizens reflected on how law touches daily life, realizing that structure and humanity must coexist. The hearing had become more than legal procedure, was an intellectual, emotional, and social exercise, illustrating how balance between rules and lived experience is essential for thoughtful governance. By the end of the day, it was clear Part 3 of the hearing had intensified the conversation. Crockett had dug deeper, framed questions that humanized law, and challenged the courtroom to consider fairness, not just in principle, but in practice. Roberts had maintained authority, emphasizing structure and consistency. Both perspectives had merit, and both had been heard. The audience left engaged, thoughtful, and reflective, anticipating how the discussion might evolve in the final part of the hearing. The courtroom was quieter than before, but the energy was far from gone. Everyone in the gallery could feel the kind of tension that comes when ideas are being tested. Not with aggression, but with clarity. JohnRoberts.com and methodical sat at the bench reviewing notes, aware that the conversation had grown beyond what he had anticipated. Jasmine Crockett, composed and deliberate, had already reframed the debate, showing that law, while necessary, interacts with human life in ways that cannot always be predicted. Part 4 would not just continue the hearing, would bring the discussion to its most reflective, thought-provoking stage. Roberts began by reiterating the importance of consistency in the law. Without structured rules, he explained, justice risks becoming subjective, unpredictable, and uneven. The legal system, he stressed, is designed to be impartial, relying on precedent, safeguards, and clear interpretation. Deviating from these principles, he argued, could undermine fairness for all citizens. His voice was firm but measured, demonstrating decades of experience. Yet, even as he spoke, the audience could sense that Crockett had already shifted the lens through which they were viewing the discussion. Structure alone, without consideration of human experience, left gaps that could impact ordinary lives. Crockett's turn was calm, almost understated, but full of force. She began by acknowledging the authority of law and Roberts' points about consistency. Then she pivoted, asking a simple but profound question. Chief Justice Roberts, how do we ensure that rules designed for fairness don't unintentionally create hardship for everyday people? She illustrated her point with concrete examples. A college student had been reprimanded for expressing opinions online without realizing the rule's technicalities. A small business owner had struggled to comply with complex privacy regulations, unintentionally violating policies while trying to follow the law. A single parent had faced confusing digital compliance measures, creating stress and uncertainty. Each story was short but vivid, allowing the audience to connect with the human side of legal decisions. Roberts listened, his expression thoughtful. He emphasized that the legal system has review mechanisms and safeguards designed to prevent unfair outcomes. Appeals, discretion in rulings, and oversight are all part of the judicial framework, he explained. But Crockett anticipated these points, pressing the discussion toward practical consequences. Even with safeguards, she asked, how do we ensure no one suffers unnecessarily? How do we balance authority with humanity, consistency with real-world impact? Her questions were simple, but the implications were profound. Every person in the room, from students to journalists, felt the tension between abstract, rules, and lived experience. The courtroom dynamic had changed significantly from the start of the hearing. Roberts defended structure and authority with precision. Crockett introduced human perspective, illustrating how laws affect daily life. Neither side was confrontational. Both were measured, intelligent, and respectful. Yet the contrast was clear. Authority without perspective risks appearing rigid and disconnected. Perspective without authority risks unpredictability. The audience could see the delicate balance that governance demands. Every exchange pushed listeners to think critically, reflecting on the broader implications of policy and law in society. Crockett continued to bring the discussion to life with micro-legal examples. She spoke about a student navigating online freedom of expression, a worker trying to comply with digital privacy regulations, and a small business owner trying to balance compliance with livelihood. Each scenario demonstrated that while legal structures are necessary, understanding human behavior and anticipating consequences are equally essential. Her calm, deliberate delivery kept the chamber engaged. The audience could easily imagine the situations she described, and in doing so, they connected emotionally to the abstract issues being debated. Roberts responded thoughtfully, emphasizing that rules must remain consistent to prevent inequality and favoritism. Without structure, he argued, fairness itself becomes subjective. Yet Crockett's examples reminded everyone that fairness in practice extends beyond rigid procedure. Her approach wasn't about opposing authority, it was about enriching understanding. By connecting law to lived experience, she showed that perspective and authority can coexist. And that thoughtful dialogue benefits the justice system as much as it benefits citizens. As the hearing progressed, Crockett highlighted the ripple effects of legal decisions. Minor missteps under the law could cascade, affecting education, employment, and family stability. A seemingly small penalty could disrupt a student's academic progress, threaten a business's survival, or create confusion for a family navigating digital systems. Roberts emphasized safeguards, discretion, and review processes, but Crockett's framing illuminated that no system is perfect. She asked the audience to consider the human element alongside structure, encouraging reflection rather than confrontation. The energy in the courtroom was contemplative yet engaged. Students leaned forward, whispering notes to each other. Journalists adjusted cameras and microphones, recognizing that Crockett's examples would resonate far beyond the courtroom. Citizens in the gallery nodded, reflecting on their own experiences and understanding how law affects daily life. The debate had moved from procedure to perspective, from abstraction to lived experience, without losing the seriousness and respect owed to the legal framework. Crockett continued, showing how balance between authority and empathy is essential for effective governance. Laws are necessary to provide structure, stability, and fairness. But without understanding real-world consequences, they can create stress, fear, or unintended harm. She asked, how do we ensure that protection doesn't become restriction and guidance doesn't become punishment? Her questions were simple, yet they resonated deeply. The audience could see how legal theory interacts with human behavior in complex ways, and the hearing had become a platform for critical reflection rather than simple argument. By the end of the session, it was clear that no single viewpoint had won. Roberts had successfully defended the principles of consistency and authority, while Crockett had ensured that human consequences were visible and considered. The audience left with questions, reflections, and a newfound understanding of how law touches everyday life. Students discussed scenarios they could relate to. Journalists highlighted her examples for broader coverage. Citizens reflected on how rules, authority, and empathy intersect in real-world contexts. The debate had become more than a hearing. It was a lesson in balance, responsibility, and perspective. Outside the courtroom, conversation flowed naturally. People discussed what they had observed, reflecting on scenarios Crockett had described. They considered how structure and empathy could coexist, how rules and perspective could complement one another, and how balance is critical for fair outcomes. The hearing had sparked curiosity and thoughtful reflection, proving that respectful, intelligent debate could illuminate complex issues in ways statistics and charts never could. As the chamber emptied, Crockett's calm insistence on perspective lingered in memory. Roberts' commitment to authority and consistency remained clear. Together, they had modeled the ideal of balanced discussion. Rules and structure matter, but empathy and human insight cannot be ignored. The audience left thinking, reflecting, and discussing not in terms of winners or losers, but in terms of understanding, responsibility, and the consequences of decisions in a complex world. In the end, the story of Roberts and Crockett was not about conflict, dominance, or defeat. It was about engagement, reflection, and the challenge of balancing law with life. One perspective emphasized authority, structure, and predictability. The other highlighted humanity, context, and real-world impact. Both were necessary. Together, they created a discussion that was intellectually rich, emotionally resonant, and thought-provoking for anyone paying attention. The hearing closed, but its lessons endured. Law exists to serve people, and understanding those people is essential for fair and responsible governance. The debate had shown that respectful questioning, careful framing, and human-centered examples can deepen understanding without undermining authority. The audience left, not with answers, but with awareness aware of the tension between structure and life, authority and empathy, rules and consequence. And in that awareness, the discussion had achieved its true purpose, encouraging reflection, understanding, and critical thinking in a complex, modern world.